So it's really an honor to be here and share my story and my family's story to facilitate this panel of amazing people. Next up, we have Eileen O'Shaughnessy. She's a nuclear abolitionist, organizer, educator, and musician. Thank you. We heard her music in the intro, and we'll hear it again at the end. So Eileen teaches about nuclear issues, environmental and racial justice, and gender studies at the University of New Mexico and Central New Mexico Community College. Eileen, along with Leona Morgan, co-founded the Nuclear Issues Study Group to dismantle nuclear colonialism through education, activism, and art. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Pam. And thank you, Yukiyo, also for sharing so vulnerably about the ways in which nuclearism has created so much harm. I'm going to share my screen shortly here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Eileen O'Shaughnessy, and I live and work on Tiwa lands here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I am not impacted by the violence of nuclear issues in the same direct way as my co-panelists, which is very indicative of how environmental racism and nuclear colonialism specifically target Indigenous and communities of color. I have worked in solidarity with impacted communities here in New Mexico for the past 11 years. And in that time, I've developed a social justice curriculum, which connects students to the essential work of impacted communities. I'm really excited to have my undergraduate students from the University of New Mexico present here today on this Zoom call. Hello, students. So although nuclear issues impact Indigenous and communities of color disproportionately, the devastation of nuclear technologies is a story that spirals out globally, impacting and ultimately threatening us all. So I'm going to be talking specifically about education, activism, and nuclear colonialism in New Mexico and beyond. These are the topics I'm going to cover briefly. I'm going to talk about the nuclear education pipeline here in New Mexico, the 4 characteristics of nuclearism. I'm going to touch on the Trinity test site and the impacts and activism around that particular site. And lastly, I'm going to mention a proposed high-level nuclear waste dump site here in New Mexico and in Texas. So as an educator, I'm extremely passionate about the potential for education to be used as a tool for liberation. But I'm also aware of the ways in which education can also be used as a weapon. And here in New Mexico, we have 2 weapons factories, essentially. We have 2 laboratories at Sandia and Los Alamos. And both are actively building today in 2022 and manufacturing nuclear weapons. And Los Alamos in particular is in the midst of a massive push right now to increase the production of nuclear warhead triggers. Another name for that is plutonium pits. And they need a growing workforce to do this dangerous work. So Los Alamos contractors are now turning towards the schools and the community colleges in northern New Mexico to promote this dangerous work as quote unquote workforce training pipelines. And what's really important to note is that these schools primarily serve Indigenous and communities of color, who are essentially being targeted for some of the most dangerous jobs, handling radioactive and hazardous material, putting them on the front line of the dangerous work of building nuclear weapons, which, as we can see at this point, is a historical and current pattern, as we've heard from our presenters today. So this is just one reason that we really need critical, engaged educational strategies that tell the whole truthful story of nuclearism, especially from the perspective of those who are most impacted. So in my classes and in my work, I find it's useful to provide analytic frameworks that help us to better understand how nuclearism and nuclear technologies function. And these are 2 anthropologists, Nader and Gusterson, who decided to look closely at nuclear-armed societies around the world, such as the United States, the UK, France, Russia. And when they did this, they found that there were consistent ways in which these societies were, in their words, deformed by the quest for nuclear technologies. So there were four consistent elements that they saw in these societies who were pursuing nuclear technology, which is in the form of nuclear weapons or nuclear energy. So the first one, nuclear colonialism, we've been discussing, which essentially identifies the way in which communities of color and especially indigenous communities are targeted for the most negative impacts of nuclearism, whether it's the waste or the testing. They are externalized in many ways for the negative impacts. And secrecy is another element that these anthropologists identified in terms of needing to not only hide the technical secrets of the nuclear weapons themselves, but also to hide the negative impacts, the environmental degradations, the human rights violations, which necessarily come along with the pursuit of nuclear technologies. The third characteristic, othering, is essentially a form of dehumanization. And we can see that very clearly in the story of how Hiroshima and Nagasaki, how Japan was targeted in particular for the only use of nuclear weapons in a wartime fashion. And lastly, mass numbing is a characteristic that was identified by these anthropologists as a way in which human beings who live in societies with nuclear weapons, we must numb ourselves, is what they are arguing. Robert J. Lifton is a psychologist who has done extensive research in pointing out how it requires us to sort of psychically numb ourselves in order to handle the immensity of suffering. And I want to thank you all who are joining us on this webinar, because just by being here and hearing these stories and being present, you are inherently challenging the process of mass numbing. And I wanted to just back up for a moment and give you a global perspective here, because this is a global story. Ultimately, I'm focusing a little bit on New Mexico here, but it's important to have that global perspective. So the bomb that was dropped on Yukiyo's grandparents here in Japan, I hope you can see my cursor, was dreamed up in the hills of Los Alamos, New Mexico over here, and it was tested in Alamogordo, New Mexico. The uranium for the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was actually mined in a mine called Shinkwolobwe here at the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that uranium, by the way, still poisons the air and water. And that uranium was then taken to Hanford, Washington, which we heard about from Pam, where Pam's father worked. It was enriched to create plutonium, which was used to create the bomb specifically that was dropped on Nagasaki. So part of what we're doing today is we're mapping this trail of devastation and destruction that begins in New Mexico, but it makes its way around the world to Japan, as well as to the Marshall Islands, where testing happened. And we're going to hear later from Benetick about the work around justice in that particular area. So as an educator, one of the things I love to do is to take my students around New Mexico to these specific sites so that they can see with their own eyes and they can meet those who are most impacted by these technologies. And this semester, we're going to be going to the Trinity site to meet with the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium. And this is my friend Tina Cordova, who is the co-founder. And the Tularosa Basin Downwinders are doing very important work to raise awareness about the ways in which this one test, which happened before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that happened on July 16th, 1945, it was overpacked with plutonium, as Tina talks about. And when it went off, that plutonium spread far and wide. And it created a situation where the communities and the families that lived around this area, some of them as close as 12 miles away from this test site, were overexposed to radiation. And the downwinders are doing essential work to raise awareness about receiving compensation. So in the 90s, there was a bill that was passed called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA for short. And unfortunately, this act did not include New Mexico downwinders. It also did not include post-1971 uranium workers, which is a gross oversight. And so right now in Congress, in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, there are two bills that would expand coverage for New Mexico downwinders and post-1971 uranium workers. And we're in a very important window here because RECA is set to expire in July of this summer. So I want to just clearly ask all of you out there to call your representatives and your senators and really encourage them to support the expansion of RECA. The last thing I want to mention today is a way in which, again, nuclear issues continue to impact communities here in New Mexico today. This is not an issue that is just relegated to the past. It's happening right now. I think it's probably been clear, but New Mexico has been really overburdened by the negative impacts of the nuclear industry. And, right here in our state, we have almost every aspect of what's known as the nuclear fuel cycle represented. But one aspect of the fuel cycle that we don't have is a commercial nuclear power plant. And so this map shows in red around the country the sites of nuclear power plants, which there's about 100. And as you can see, they're mostly on the coast, some in the Midwest. Currently, there's a plan to bring all of the waste from all of those power plants on trains, and barges, and bring it to New Mexico and Texas, these two sites here in turquoise. This is a really dangerous plan. It's something that's never been done before. And it's just another example of environmental racism, frankly, to dump this waste in an area that's primarily communities of color. And after I'm done here, we're going to hear from Rose Gardner, who lives literally between these two sites, about what impact this would have to bring high-level waste to this community. So in conclusion, I just want to ask two things really clearly of all of you out there. Thank you so much for joining this webinar. Again, I want to ask that you call your senators and representatives and ask them to support these amendments to expand RECA. You can visit the trinitydownwinders.org for more information, especially if you live in Utah, Texas, or Montana. Those are states where Republican Congress people, there's kind of hope to push them in the right direction. And then lastly, in the realm of critical education that is telling the full truth about nuclear history and present, I really want to urge you to donate to the Marshallese Education Initiative, and there will be a link in the chat to do that. Today is my birthday, so if you forgot to give me a birthday gift, you can just do these two things and that will make me so happy. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to close by sharing this beautiful mural that was created by a dear friend of mine, Noel Marquez, from Artesia, New Mexico, who passed away this year. He was an incredible artist and activist who worked on these issues. And this is his piece, La Tierra, a dichotomy between the sacred and the desecrated, respect our mother. And I just want to honor and acknowledge all those that we've lost to exposure to radiation, to impacts around nuclear issues. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Eileen, for all of your work, for your music, and for sharing, especially with students.